Okay, so the next step is to assign estimates to all the stories in our backlog. Now the way we're going to do this is we're going to use a shortcut up here called the estimation wall. And this estimation exercise I'm about to show you is based around the concept of story points as a means of assigning estimates on stories. Now if you're familiar with story points, then that's great. If not, we have a separate video that you can find in the overview which explains the story points concept. And if this is a new concept to you, I ask you to stop watching this video and go watch the story points video first, then come back to this after you've completed the story points video, because this will make a lot more sense once you understand what a story point is all about. So I'm assuming you know what a story point is and you get the idea of how they work. Now let me show you how you would actually do your estimates in Mingle. First we'll click on Maximize View to hide everything else. And now what we see is a simple card wall. And there's columns for all the 1-point stories, 2-point stories, 3, 5, 8, 13, and 21-point stories. In our project, a story can have any one of these values for its story points setting. Now, so far, we haven't done estimates on any of the stories. So you'll notice there's a column over here on the far left called Not Set, and that's because these stories have a story point value that's not yet set. You'll notice that the two stories at the top are 22 and 21, which are the two stories that I prioritized earlier in one of the previous videos. And if we scroll down, this actually shows us all the stories in the entire release backlog. So what we typically recommend is that we do estimation as a team exercise. And if everyone is all in the same location, you can just get everyone in one room, put Mingle up on the projector or on a large screen monitor, and you can go through this in person. If people are distributed around the world, you can use some sort of screen sharing technology to do the same sort of thing. What we recommend is that you first ask everyone on the team, analysts, developers, testers, to come up with an estimate in story points for every story that you want to do your estimates on. In this case, we're just going to run through the entire backlog. And then you start at the top of the list, and you ask everyone to reveal, either over the phone if it's a distributed team or in person, what their estimate was. And in some cases, everyone agrees on the estimate. In other cases, there's a wild disagreement over whether it's a 2-point story or an 8-point story. And that needs to be discussed. And Mingle is here to maybe help foster those discussions, but there's definitely a part of this process that's just a human process that Mingle is not intended to automate for you. What Mingle is intended to automate is the recording of the estimate. So once your team has reached a consensus on the size of a story, the way to apply the estimate to the card is just to pick it up and drag it out into the card wall. Now I've just told Mingle that this is a 3-point story because I dragged it out of the not set column and I dropped it into the 3-point column. So once we've done a few estimates, this actually gets easier because the more stories we estimate, we can start using these as our guideline for estimating future stories. As we pick up story 12 here, as a seller I can enter the details of my boat for sale. We can look at these 3-point stories and say, is it the same size? We'll all agree it's not. We also all agree it's not smaller. It might be the same size as this 5-point story, but we actually think it's bigger, and we decided to make this an 8-point story. So the real magic to this estimation wall is that the more stories you estimate, the better your team gets, because the real goal here is for your estimates to be consistent. So what I care about the most is making sure that all the stories that are 3-point stories are roughly the same size, and they should all be bigger than these 1- and 2-point stories and smaller than these 5- and 8-point stories. And the teams that we've worked with have said that having this sort of view is incredibly helpful to them because they can see all the stories they've already estimated and start to use those as really as their guide and their metric for how they should estimate the remaining ones. Now I'm doing this rather quickly just for the sake of time, but this is something you would be doing as part of a collaborative process with your team. Now you might be wondering, okay, well that's great, but how do we start? Well, there's two schools of thought on where you start. One school of thought is to find the smallest story in your backlog and make that a 1-point story, and then to build everything up from there. And that's one way of doing it that works for a number of teams. Another way of doing it is to find what you believe to be a medium-sized story, something that would fall somewhere in the middle of the scale, in this case a 3- or 5-point story. make that a 3-point story or maybe a 5-point story, and then everything else should scale up or down from there. You can use that as a gauge to say, is the story I'm evaluating bigger or smaller than the first story that I estimated? And you can go from there. So as I work through this, you can see we start to get all of our stories estimated. And if I make my font a little bit smaller, you can get a sense of what this looks like. So now we have estimates on all of our stories. And from here, we can start to plan the first sprint.